Okay, I think we can get started. I want to welcome everybody. Erev Tov. I hope everybody's doing well and in these tough circumstances, but circumstances you always have to look at the silver lining and the bright side, and the amount of, I think, extra learning and extra caring from one person to another has really gone up exponentially, and I think that's something positive, and hopefully we'll come out of this a lot stronger and better. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Rynhold, who we're supposed to host on Shabbat in our home, and he was going to be the guest speaker in our shul on Shabbat, but needless to say, that did not happen. So we're going with our next best opportunity. We're actually meeting online. He's a professor at Yeshiva University at Bernard's Revel Graduate School, professor of philosophy. As you'll soon hear, he was born in London, England. And this semester, he's a visiting professor, first live until a couple of weeks ago at University of Toronto, and he's now back home in Teaneck, New Jersey, but we're doing this online. So it's really a pleasure to have him. As I think many of you know, we've got classes now every morning at 11 a.m. and 8:30 p.m. That's our schedule currently. We'll see if we may add a couple of shiurim to that. And really we invite you to come and to invite your friends and take advantage of the situation. And this evening, or today's learning, is being sponsored by Jeff Weiss in honor of the yahrzeit of his father, Binyamin Ben Chaim, the 34th yahrzeit. So wish the Neshama should have an aliyah. And with that, we'll pass the microphone over to Dr. Rynhold. Thank you very much, everybody. By the way, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat box. We'll get to them eventually. Or you can raise your hand, and then somebody will see, and then you could be able to speak at a certain point. But without further ado, Vakasha, Dr. Rynhold.
Hi, good evening, everybody. So yes, as you can hear, I'm not from round here, though where from round here means right now could be anywhere, given the virtual nature of this. So it's very nice to meet you, if only this way rather than in person. And what we're going to do tonight is an introduction to medieval Jewish philosophy, right? So people often ask, what is philosophy? And just to lower expectations sufficiently from the beginning, I'm not sure. And I've been studying it for 30 years. The best definitions you get are usually the classic one-liners like a philosopher is somebody who has a problem for every solution. Or alternately, that philosophy asks questions only children would ask and answers them as only lawyers would. Other than that, I'm not entirely sure that defining philosophy is terribly helpful. You're probably better off just doing some and kind of then finding out. But there was a very famous Cambridge philosopher whose name was G.E. Moore. I'll type that in because he was known by everybody just by the name Moore. They didn't even use the initials. And when he was asked what is philosophy, he used to point to his bookshelves and say it's what those are about. So if you're trying to define Jewish philosophy, or if I were trying to define Jewish philosophy, I suppose I could point at my other bookshelves and say it's what those books are about. Of course, the problem is, why did I put one set of books on my philosophy shelf and one set of books on my Jewish philosophy shelf? Just pushes the question back. What are the criteria? What is it that makes something Jewish philosophy, or indeed philosophy? And just to kick things off, there is actually a problem, some people think, with the whole idea of Jewish philosophy in the first place. I'm going to now share with you something that is well, quite a well-known dilemma, shall we say, that will hopefully come up on the screen presently. If it doesn't, do let me know. But we are going to take a look at the following dilemma. All right, do we all have that? We can all see, yeah?
Yep.
So we have here the following dilemma from Zev Levy, and we'll read it together, but then we'll pause and explain. He asks the following question, right? He says, how can a certain concept be truly philosophical and simultaneously Jewish in its essence. When one posits certain values which are found in Jewish sources, then one of two conclusions must be valid. If the value has philosophical meaning, its Jewish origin is merely of historical interest. If it contains meaning that is uniquely Jewish, it ceases to be philosophical as the term is generally defined. Okay, all right, so that's the quote or the dilemma. What does it mean? So just to explain, it's probably best to use a different example that would render this dilemma maybe more familiar, right? So let's take, for example, Einstein's theory of general relativity, okay? So Einstein was Jewish. So it is the case that it has a Jewish origin, and that is of historical interest, right? We're interested in the fact that, a Jew came up with this, and that's nice. On the other hand, of course, that doesn't make it Jewish science, because there's no such thing as Jewish science. If it's science, it's just science. It ceases to be particularly Jewish, though its Jewish origin is of historical interest, right? But why isn't it the same for philosophy? Right? If something is philosophically valid or true, then is it not just philosophically valid or true? Truth is truth. Most people think that truth is universal, right? You don't have something that's true in science for one group or ethnicity, and it's not true for another. It's either true or it's not, period. And like we say, great, if Jews came up with it, then yay, that's, we won. But fact is, doesn't make it Jewish science. Why should philosophy be any different, right? Why should there be any such thing as Jewish philosophy? If it's philosophy, then it's just true. And if it's Jewish, well, then not philosophy. It's just something Jews do or think or believe, but it's not necessarily universally true. So is it philosophy, right? That's the dilemma. Okay, so there's kind of conceptual question regarding whether or not there can be any such thing as Jewish philosophy. All right. Well, I'm momentarily going to stop that just to see if everybody's good with that. Are we clear? Does anybody want to chip in, ask a question, or clarify anything there? Or are we happy with the dilemma? We're all good? Okay, excellent. So there you go. No such thing as Jewish philosophy. 7 minutes, we're finished. Good night. It's been a pleasure, and I hope to see you again. Now, I'm not actually going to answer that dilemma. Right? I'm going to leave that dilemma hanging. But one thing is true, and that is people have done something that they have called Jewish philosophy. And certainly in medieval times, that Jewish philosophy seemed to have some kind of shared nature that we can maybe discuss and understand. So leaving aside this kind of conceptual problem, but what is Jewish philosophy in the abstract? How can you do such a thing? I don't know, but people kind of did it. So our interest tonight is going to be what it was specifically that the medievals did, right? So what is medieval Jewish philosophy? Right, that's our question. And famously, there is this account of Jewish philosophy. And again, Jewish philosophy in general, this could apply to modern Jewish philosophy potentially as well, though for reasons we won't get into this evening, it won't be something that we'll delve into in any detail. And yeah, I will kind of post this source sheet either here to the chat, or I will post it somewhere that you will be able to get hold of it yourselves. And if you actually, I will just see if I can do that momentarily. But in the meantime, I'm going to just bring us back to our source sheet and look at the second quote from Julius Gutmann. Julius Gutmann was historian of Jewish philosophy, Jewish philosopher, wrote one of the classic works that's a kind of single volume survey of Jewish philosophy, originally in German, translated. And he defined Jewish philosophy, or at least spoke of Jewish philosophy, in the following way. Have a look at the second quote here on the shared screen. The Jewish people, he writes, did not begin to philosophize because of an irresistible urge to do so. Frankly, in parentheses, I'll just add, I'm not sure many people have an irresistible urge to do philosophy unless they're kind of sad like me, but he is there saying that the Jews did not begin philosophy because of an irresistible urge to do so. They received philosophy from outside. And the history of Jewish philosophy is the history of the successive absorptions of foreign ideas, which were then transformed and analyzed according to specific Jewish points of view, right? What Gutmann is saying is that regardless of our dilemma up above, clearly there was something that was done that was called Jewish philosophy. And it appears as if that endeavor, that discipline, if you like, of Jewish philosophy was originally motivated by a clash, right? A clash between Jewish philosophy on the one hand and something else on the outside. And there was some form of absorption of this outside set of views within Judaism, and those views or ideas were somehow transformed. And it's that idea of Jewish philosophy that I want to explore a little bit, and I suppose explain a little bit. And I want to do so from two different perspectives. The first really pays attention to the initial sentence there, which is that it didn't begin through an irresistible urge to do so. So let's just think historically, how did it begin? Why did it begin? Because if you think about it, it is true that if you take our classical texts, right, so take the Tanakh and take the Talmud, right, and those two texts, if you read them, you wouldn't immediately think of them as philosophical texts, right? You can tell a philosophical text usually because you start to hear yourself snore after a few pages. But even leaving that aside, right, if you've ever read any philosophy, if you've ever read any Kant, or you've ever read any Schopenhauer, if you've ever read any Aristotle or Plato for that matter, it's not the same genre as reading Tanakh or the Talmud. So one could certainly argue that our classical texts, Jewishly speaking, aren't really philosophy. Now, that's not to say that they don't deal with philosophical ideas. It's not to say that they don't maybe provoke thought about philosophical issues. But I think it's probably fair to say they aren't really philosophy texts. Right now, there are those who disagree with that. Some people might be familiar with a book by Yoram Hazony, The Philosophy of Hebrew Scripture, where he tries to argue that Tanakh is kind of a work of reason, a different form of philosophizing, maybe, putting an alternate philosophical worldview. It's a very interesting book. I'm not sure I agree with the thesis, so to speak, that it is being put forward as a self-consciously philosophical work, right? So I would maintain that, at least on the surface, whilst there are philosophical ideas underpinning these things, right, they aren't philosophical works in and of themselves, right? And let's now just think more generally, right? Something that doesn't need any amount of philosophical acumen, right? I don't know about you, but I know lots of Jews, lots of really wonderful Jews who I respect immensely, better Jews than I, and they've never read a work of Jewish philosophy, right? It simply is the case that Jewish philosophy and works of Jewish philosophy relative to other works are a little bit marginal. Right? That people know them, people may know the Gemara and Halakha, and they do some Jewish thought stuff, but the amount of the percentage, let's say, of Jews who are familiar with even the most famous work of Jewish philosophy, right? Which I think most people would accept is probably the Rambam, Moses Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed Moreh Nevuchim, right? Dalalat al-Ha'irin, actually, it was written in Arabic. So the fact is, this is the most famous, most influential work of Jewish philosophy. How many people have read it? All right, how many people have read it? So truth is, Jewish philosophy doesn't seem to be, as Gutman puts it, Jewish people did not begin to philosophize because of an irresistible urge. More than that, it just doesn't really seem indigenous to Jewish philosophy, right? It's rather to Judaism. Philosophy doesn't seem to be indigenous to Judaism, right? It's a little bit marginal. I think it kind of remains that way. I always remember one of the great backhanded compliments I once received when I was a philosophy undergrad. So I did an undergraduate degree in philosophy, and in England, by the way, I don't know if people are familiar with the setup, but in England, if you do a degree in philosophy, what that means is you spend 3 years at university studying philosophy and nothing else, right? 3 years just studying philosophy, right? So that's pretty, serious engagement with philosophy. And while I was there as an undergraduate, I was in a place where there's good Jewish life for students, but not a big Jewish community. And a rabbi used to drive from London every week and give us a Gemara shiur. And those who wanted would attend, and it was great. And I used to go. And I always remember him once telling me that a young lady had asked him about studying philosophy at university and said to him that she was interested in studying philosophy, but she's heard things, is it something she should do? Is it something she should not do? And he told me that he responded to her as follows by saying, well, I know somebody that I give a shiur to every week, and he's doing philosophy and he seems okay. So, that was as good as it got. It's marginal, right? Philosophy is not inherent. So how did it begin and why? Right? Fact is that Jewish philosophy really only gets going seriously in the Middle Age, during the medieval period. And most people look to someone like Saadia Gaon as the first really systematic Jewish philosopher stroke theologian. And he wrote his major work already into the kind of 9th, 10th century, right? We're in the 10th century. So we've gone already a couple of thousand years without Jewish philosophy. Why does it suddenly begin? There is somebody, Philo, who was a contemporary of Jesus, who wrote philosophy, but it didn't really get off the ground. The medievals didn't even know about him. They didn't cite him, didn't know of his work. And he wasn't even preserved by Jews. His works were preserved by the early church fathers because he was a contemporary of Jesus, and they maintained his work for kind of that reason, and because it was actually quite amenable in some way to certain Christian ideas. But the fact is that there's this one guy, Philo of Alexandria. He wrote philosophy around about the year 0, right, or 1. Or at least in the first decades, right, from that period, and didn't really catch on, wasn't even preserved by us. We only found out latterly that it had been preserved by the early church fathers. So we're talking a couple of thousand years before we really get Jewish philosophy. Why? How did it suddenly come about? And ironically, it came about through our facility with Arabic and our integration into Islamic society up to a point. And integration there is used very much with quotation marks. But at this point in time, right, if we're talking about from the 9th century, the Jews on the whole are living under Islamic rule. And during this period, 2 things happen. Number one, there is the beginnings of a whole translation project, right? That most people speak of an Abbasid caliph called Al-Mamun in the early 9th century, right? So an Islamic leader, and he has a dream, allegedly, where an angel, actually Aristotle, appears to him in a dream and tells him that Islam is compatible with philosophy. This is the origin myth, probably not true, right? But as a result, so the story goes, Al-Mamun begins a translation project. He hires people, well-paid job, by the way. I don't know, this was some time ago, and now I don't know in terms of Corona era currency exchange rates between medieval currency and contemporary currency. But apparently, in the books written over the last few years, you could earn about $24,000 a month as a translator to translate these works, the equivalent of that, to translate works of philosophy into Arabic. So you get this grand translation project beginning around about the, you know, the 8th to 9th century within the Islamic world at a very high powered level, right? This is being endorsed by the highest powers within the Islamic Caliphate. And they begin translating all these classic works into Arabic. A. B. At this point, the Jews are becoming a little bit more urbanized. They're moving into more urban areas. They're speaking Arabic, and they are therefore having some kind of discourse with their Muslim hosts. And therefore, for the first time, Jews are able to read, are exposed to these classic Greek philosophical texts. So there's a historical answer, right, to how it begins in this period. And it's very much to do with this Arabic translation project, translating all these texts into Arabic, and Jews living within that environment and being Arabic speakers and having increased discourse with their hosts, right? So historically, that's how it begins. But we're more interested philosophically or conceptually in how it begins. Yeah, a lot of interesting questions, by the way, that arise out of that in terms of, for example, it becomes very important to know which texts they had access to and translated and which they didn't, because that leads Jewish philosophy down a particular line as opposed to another line, right? If you've got a translation of, say, Plato's Republic, but not Aristotle's Politics, then you're going to have a particular view of political thought rather than an alternative. And this is true across the board, and that becomes very significant within the trajectory of medieval Jewish philosophy. But as I say, I'm more interested in, I suppose, the conceptual reasons that medieval Jewish philosophy flowers at this point. We've got the opportunity, right? Suddenly these texts are available. We can read them. We can deal with them. But that's all very well. Why would we? What's the motivation? Just because they're there, right? Why is it that this, admittedly, treasure trove of texts suddenly available? Why is it that we started to read them? Why were we bothered? Right? So what is the beginning of Jewish philosophy, medieval Jewish philosophy, from that perspective? Okay, and that's going to be our key question moving forward now. Again, I'll pause if anybody wants to ask any questions, raise any points for discussion, then please do feel free. You can press the raise hand thing and it'll come up and I'll see it, or type something as a message and we will pause and take some question discussion if there is any at that point. I see a Moshe Gelberman, is that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so go ahead, unmute and
yeah, so I mean, how early would you say like non-Jewish, like non-Jewish philosophy books that we would classify as like, I guess being in the same genre of things like, I guess everything from Guide to the Perplexed to Kant, like how early would those in the non-Jewish world, how early would those books start?
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, I mean, they begin already in the 4th century BCE, right? Okay. Because at that point, you've already got Aristotle and Plato writing, right? And then that continues into, you know, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, where you get commentaries on those works. So you have already that genre.
Right. I mean, I guess parts of Talmud are philosophical discussions, right? Like, it's not a whole book dedicated to it, but they definitely do engage in like direct philosophy, at least in some small areas. It's never like, you know, huge, you know, it's not like a whole, I guess Pirkei Avos maybe is like sort of wholly philosophical, kind of, but yeah, I mean, there's definitely at least a few sugyas.
Right. Again, so I you know, it's difficult to, I would still go on the whole to, they maybe raise questions of philosophical interest, as opposed to being kind of philosophical, right? From the perspective of what was self-consciously being done at that point within the discipline of philosophy, if you like, such as it was. I mean, philosophy back then is more or less just science. There wasn't really a science philosophy distinction as there is today. But the fact is that there are very few that are genuinely philosophical discussions or arguments as such. Do they touch on philosophical issues? Again, 100%. Are they distinctly philosophical? That, I think, is still more questionable. And those that you could really identify as genuinely being of that nature are going to be very few and far between. And I would include Pirkei Avot within that, right? A lot of it is just, you know, ethics and ethical advice, as opposed to something distinctly philosophical, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. And there's a Yehuda Greenfield there, I see, also.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Is it
I can, absolutely.
Hey, great. So you spoke about how they would translate the Arabic works, and that kind of is what made Jewish philosophy available. So was Jewish
translating works into Arabic? Yeah.
Translating the Greek work. So was Jewish philosophy just kind of integrating Greek philosophy with Judaism, or was it presenting something novel?
So that's a very good question, because that really goes back to the first quote we looked at. And that's something that, as we will delve into that now moving forward. And by the end of our time here tonight, we'll, well, I guess we'll just repose that question rather than answering it. But, you know, that's a very good question. And that's something about which people continue to argue to this day, right? Somebody as significant in, say, the modern Orthodox world as Rav Soloveitchik, right? Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik famously argues that the majority of medieval Jewish philosophy, there is nothing Jewish about it, right? He says that about the guide. I actually happen to have this, I think, on my desk. Here we are. Let me give you a very brief quote from the end of Soloveitchik's Halachic Mind, which was published in 1986, but originally written in 1944. And in that work, he writes on page 100, right? And I will, you don't have this, but since the question was asked, I will just read this to you. He writes, "We know that the most central concepts of medieval Jewish philosophy are rooted in ancient Greek and medieval Arabic thought, and are not of Jewish origin at all. It is impossible to reconstruct a unique Jewish world perspective out of alien material." Okay, so there are those, including Rav Soloveitchik, who are skeptical as to the, I guess you might say, the Jewishness, yeah, of the philosophy that comes through this this process that we're discussing. All right, and there are others who would maintain that no, we do, as going back to what Gutman says in that quote that we will be returning to shortly, right, that they were somehow, these ideas are transformed from a Jewish perspective, and therefore there is something distinctively Jewish. But the question about Jewish philosophy per se is always, you know, is Hermann Cohen, say, is he just Kant with a kippah, right? And ditto the Rambam. Is he just really Aristotle, right? And it's a fair question, and we will spin that out a little more over the remaining time we have now. Okay. Okay. Let us, there are a couple of questions down here. A question from Miriam here in the chat. How do you reconcile Jewish philosophy at the risks, if you will, on Greek philosophy with Masorah? Very good question, and something that I will just state and have to kind of leave hanging. If we do this, you know, further and more down the line, you'll get actual examples of this. But one thing you have to give up on very, very quickly, right? If you are doing Jewish philosophy, and I'm talking here about Rishonim, I'm talking about Rambam, Ralbag, and, you know, nothing beyond, so to speak, the canon. Pshat is out the window, right? Genuinely. I mean, the way they interpret Tanakh is so far from Pshat that there are those in moderns amongst us might almost see it as disingenuous. It's not, right? They really, really believe that, you know, the Torah is true. And therefore, if Aristotle is true, the Torah must be saying the same. They absolutely believe that. From our modern perspective, we're more cynical about things like that, so we find it may be difficult, but there's no question that was what they believed. But boy, is that some way from Pshat. Okay, so that's in terms of Masorah. These thinkers would say it is absolutely reconcilable with Masorah because they think the Masorah was philosophy and we forgot it and Aristotle picked it up and now we're reclaiming it, but it's originally Jewish, right? Again, very little actual scholarly evidence for that, but they would argue this is original Masorah that's been forgotten, right? And you find that in a number of these thinkers. Okay, let us then return to the question at which we paused, which is we now have the availability of all these texts, and amongst these texts there are those that are particularly philosophical, and Jewish philosophy clearly begins. But why? Right? Just because they're there and we can read them, why would it give rise to this whole genre? So let me ask you, all right, and you can chip in whether verbally or with typing. Let's say you're trying to construct what we will, for the sake of argument, call the Jewish worldview, right? The Jewish worldview on, say, God and man. And what you've got to go on are our classical texts, like, you know, and at that point we're talking Tanakh and the Talmud, okay? And if I were to ask you, well, you know, what truths do those texts teach us about God, the nature of God, or indeed man, the nature of man, what kinds of things would you say? All right, what would you say the Tanakh tells us about God? Anything, just, you know, the kind of, you know, what kind of guy or gal is God according to our classical texts? So, for example, does God know what we're doing? Yes or no? Simple, not a trick question. Okay, according to the Tanakh and the Talmud, does God know what we're doing? Oh, there we go. So we have God as a personal relationship with each person. Yes. Okay, so at 100%, right? It's very clear that God, number one, God created the world. Okay, that's our starting point. Number two, God has a personal relationship with, I don't know about every person, but certainly with particular individuals, right? Or maybe it's closer to certain individuals or more explicit with certain individuals than others, at such that he speaks to us, speaks to people, right? More than that, he seems to care what we do, right? It matters what we do to God. Indeed, he, you know, reveals a Torah to us in order to tell us what to do. And, you know, woe betide if we don't, right? So there we go. God acts, affects history, a jealous God. All right. All of these, absolutely, 100%. Okay. And human beings, what is it to be a good, well, let's not go with human being. Let's go with Jew. right? To be a good Jew, according to, again, just this, our general classical belief system would be, how is one a good Jew? Yeah, a good Jew submits to God, right? Yeah, we perform mitzvot. That's what we do. God tells us how to behave. We behave that way. That's what we're meant to do. It's pretty straightforward. So we have here created a kind of a metaphysic, right? A view, a worldview concerning human beings, God, their relationship, God's relationship to the world. We have a powerful God who acts in history, who knows what human beings do, who cares what human beings do, who wants us to do certain things. And as Jews, we are indeed expected to do precisely those things. And if we don't, then it's not going to end well for us, right? I think that's pretty straightforward and uncontroversial as a reading of the view that Jews would come out with from a very, just a cursory reading of our classical texts, right? You don't need to be a rocket scientist to come up with this, right? Fine. So we have a Jewish worldview. Let us have a look now at the philosophical worldview, right? So suddenly this is your worldview, the one we've just discussed, and then you're presented with this. And what I'm about to share with you, okay, so our text, the text that we are going to look at now is taken from Yehuda Halevi's Kuzuri, right? So Yehuda Halevi, great Andalusian, lived in Muslim Spain, and famous as a poet and a sort of philosopher, as we'll see, writes this work, the Kuzuri. For those who aren't familiar, the Kuzuri is a fascinating work. It is a dialogue. It's written as a dialogue between the Khazar king, and at the beginning, the king has a dream, a bit like our dream, where an angel comes to him in his dream and says to this Khazar king that your intentions are worthy, but your acts are not worthy. As in, look, your heart's in the right place, yeah, but you're getting it all wrong. So Khazar king, who's a Khazar priest and head of Khazar religion, thinks to himself, oh, well, I better, try and somehow redouble my efforts in my Khazar religion. But he keeps having the same dream, no matter how hard he tries, right? Every day, an angel. Your heart's in the right place, your intentions are good, but you're doing it all wrong. So what does the Khazar king do? He decides to interview representatives of all the major religious alternatives of the day. And therefore he interviews a philosopher at the beginning first, a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew. Okay? And the Kuzuri is an account of those conversations. Now, do not think for one moment this is intended to be an even-handed representation of each religion. Okay, the philosopher Christian is 10 pages, and then the rest of the 5 books are all about the Jew, right? Conversation between the Khazar king and the Chaver, right? The rabbi Chaver. Again, this work was written in Arabic, hence I've got it here in English. There's a Hebrew translation, will still be a translation, which an English one is. So, we have here an excerpt from the Kuzuri. At the end of book 1, the Khazar king converts to Judaism, right? And actually converts his nation, his little Khazar island, to a country, municipality, to Judaism, right? And then the other 4 books are a continuing conversation between the Khazar king exploring his new religion with this Chaver. And one other thing to say, and then there's a question that I will kind of take in 1 second. This is based on truth, right? This is not a transcript of what happened, but there was indeed in the kind of somewhere in the Baltics, and there is a history of the Jews of Khazaria that has been written, right? Something did happen whereby, at the very least, the king and the upper classes and courtiers all did indeed convert to Judaism, and Yehuda Halevi is using that historical moment as the basis for what is then a fictional account of the conversations that took place, right? So just as an interesting side note, this is based on something that happened, though this is not intended to be an accurate representation of how it occurred. There was a question, somebody who was about to ask, please feel free. No? Okay. All right, so let's turn then to the Kuzuri, and this is right at the beginning. This is what the philosopher says to the king, right? So the king says, Mr. Philosopher, I've been told that I'm, not quite getting it right religiously. So tell me, what are your religious beliefs? And the philosopher tells him this, right? And by the way, before we go through this together, Yuhale spends the rest of the book trying to argue why everything we're about to read is completely and utterly false, okay? But what he's presenting here is basically the prevalent philosophical worldview of the day, right? So this is, we're now in the 11th century, but from the 10th, 11th century, all the way through the 13th century, frankly, this is the major philosophical worldview that has been presented by all the Arabic Aristotelians and in all those Muslim thinkers who were reading these translations. This is a worldview, and this is exactly the worldview that reading, that the Rambam's reading, okay, and suddenly having to grapple with. And as soon as you see it,
your voice is breaking up.
Sorry?
Your voice is breaking up.
Oh, I wonder why that would be. No idea. Is everybody muted? Because that can sometimes cause that, but if so, let me know again. All right, let's have a look at what the philosopher says. So he begins by saying, there is no favor or dislike in the nature of God, because he is above desire and intention. Desire intimates a want in the person who feels it, satisfied, but it becomes, so to speak, complete. If a fulfills that completion, what's there? Point one, then. God doesn't have desires. If you desire something, then you lack something. And if you lack something, you're not perfect, right? So if God is perfect, he can't have desires. There can't be anything God desires, because that implies a lack of perfection, right? God isn't perfect, because there's something he wants and he hasn't got. So a perfect God can't desire anything, okay? Which is kind of a problem, because we think he wants us to keep mitzvot, for example, right? So immediately you have a philosophical view of God that right from the very outset is the view of God that we built before as the Tanakh view. All right, it goes on in the third line here. In a similar way, he is, in the opinion of philosophers, above the knowledge of individuals, because the latter change with the times, while there is no change in God's knowledge. He therefore doesn't know thee much less thy thoughts and actions, nor does he listen to thy prayers or see thy movements. Okay. So number two, God doesn't know what's going on down here. Because again, God is perfect. Perfection can't change. Perfection is a stable state. If you change from perfection, there's only one way to go, and that's to imperfection. So if God is perfect, he cannot change. And if he cannot change, it cannot be that 2 hours ago, God didn't know that Daniel Rynhold would be speaking to a whole raft of people online, and now he does, right? Something's changed. God picks up that change, tracks that change, but therefore he changes, and that's no good. Obviously, there are answers to these questions, right? And some people might say, oh, he knew in advance, right? He knows the future before it happens, so he did know that I was going to be doing this. Problem with that is, makes all kinds of difficulties for free will, but we're not going to go into that for the moment, okay? Again, at the moment, we get building a picture of God, a philosophical picture of God, whereby God's perfection seems to be removing him from the picture of God with which we emerged previously discussing the Jewish worldview, right? This is deeply damaging to that view. He goes on, let's continue. If philosophers say he created you, they only use a metaphor, because he is the cause of causes in the creation of all creatures, but not because this was his intention from the beginning. He never created man, for the world is without beginning. There never arose a man through to existence before him, in whom we united forms, gifts, characteristics, inherited from father, mother, other relations, besides the influences of climate, countries, food and water, spheres, stars, and constellations. God is a creator. Right? According to the Aristotelian view, the world is eternal. The world was never created. It's always been here, coexistent with God, who's also always been here. But God never did anything, because again, to do something would be to change. Why would God suddenly decide now's a good time to make a world, as opposed to that having always been the case? That would be a change in God. He would go from being the potential creator of the world to the creator of the world. Again, change, imperfection. You can see a view of God that is some way from anything we consider a traditional Jewish view. And finally, the final half of this, in the perfect person. And this gets into certain technicalities, and we're not going to get into the technicalities of it for the sake of time. But what matters is that if we go to the line here, if thou hast reached such disposition of belief, okay? So we have this paragraph in the perfect person, etc., etc. This degree on that same line is the last most longed for goal for the perfect man, whose soul, after having been purified, has grasped the inward truths of all branches of science. So the perfect man is somebody who knows the truth of science. Thus the soul of the perfect man and that intellect become one. If thou hast reached such disposition of belief, be not concerned about the forms of thy humility or religion or worship, or the word or language or actions you employ. Thou mayest even choose a religion in the way of humility, worship, and benediction for the management of thy temperament, thy house, and the people of thy country, if they agree to it. Or fashion thy religion according to the laws of reason set up by the philosophers, and strive after purity of soul. In fine, seek purity of heart, in which way thou art, provided thou hast acquired some total knowledge in its real essence. Summary means, you want to do your prayer thing, know what matters. How you get there, I'm not bothered, right? God doesn't care. What you need, the perfect person, isn't the person who performs mitzvah. It's the person who knows all the truths, okay, all the truths of the world. And that, everybody, is the philosophical worldview. And that philosophical worldview clearly is at odds with what we previously portrayed as the Jewish worldview. You have on the one hand a robust, personal God who genuinely relates to human beings, who cares what they do, who knows what they do, who speaks to them, who created the world. And human beings, to be good human beings, perform mitzvot. The philosophers challenge that, and they argue that actually God is not that type of being at all. And Torah mitzvot might be fine as a method of gaining truth, but what actually matters is the knowledge of truth, not how one acts. And therefore, we have a problem. And that is how Jewish philosophy begins. Because what we now have is a Jewish worldview on the one hand, and the idea that revelation is a source of truth, right? And back then, unlike today, back then, that is a prevalent, everybody believes that the word of God is a source of truth. That's a common belief. We aren't under secular attack or atheistic attack. Everybody believes revelation is a source of truth. At the same time, most people believe that there is also a rational truth, that reason is also a source of truth. So what do you do when they don't say the same thing if there can only be one truth? Okay, this is the beginning of Jewish philosophy. There is a Jewish worldview, and revelation is believed to be a source of truth. There is a philosophic worldview, and reason is thought to be a realm of truth, and there can only be one truth. And the problem is these two sources of truth are in conflict. They're not saying the same thing. So what do you do? Right? That seems to be the problem for a Jewish philosopher. Okay? And as a result, what are you meant to do? Right? I'm seeing here, so when we share the document, can you not hear me? Do I fade in and out? Is that a problem
Yeah,
at the moment? It is.
Just the second time. The first time was okay, but since you took it off now, it's been very fine. Yeah, it was in and out a little bit, but thank God now it's fine. So
Okay, so what I will do then is, there is one more text, but I will just read it to you because it's relatively straightforward. And afterwards, I will share the documents that you have it, but so you can hear maybe better to just read this final text. This final text is, actually maybe you might see it, is from the introduction to the Guide of the Text by the Rambam. Okay. Because what we have now is Jewish philosophy arises, just like Gutmann said, right, out of an absorption of an external worldview, one that clashes with ours. So what do? Right? You have to somehow absorb it. Or, truth is, if you have this conflict, you have a choice, right? There are a number of things one could do. And when Rambam writes his work, Guide of the Perplexed, he tells us very explicitly at the very beginning, he starts off by saying this work, right, the understanding of this treatise, he says, it is not the purpose of this treatise to be understood by the vulgar, right? That's you, right? As in, that's, people who are not philosophically well attuned, all right? He's writing this very specifically for a very particular audience, and he tells us who they are, and that's the quote we have here, which is that, he tells us, its purpose, as in the purpose of his book, Guide of the Perplexed, is to give indications to a religious man, right, written for a religious person, for whom the validity of our law has become established in his soul, right? So this is somebody who already accepts Judaism, right? The validity of Torah is established. So he's writing for a religious person who accepts Torah. Goes on, and has become actual in his belief, such a person being perfect in his religion and character, and having studied the sciences of the philosophers and come to know what they signify, right? He's writing his work for somebody who is a committed Jew and has studied philosophy. And the problem is, for such a person, he tells us, the human intellect having drawn him on and led him to dwell within its province, he must have felt distressed by the externals of the law. Right? If you know philosophy, then you're going to read the Tanakh and you're going to think, hang on a minute, what's all this and throw on stuff? God doesn't have a hand. We know. Aristotle has taught us. God doesn't have a body. So what does it mean when the Torah, the externals of the law will trouble him? Right? What does it mean to say God has a hand or an arm? That doesn't seem to be correct, given Aristotle. So, the Rambam continues, he would remain in a state of perplexity and confusion as to whether he should follow his intellect, renounce what he knew concerning the terms in question, and consequently consider that he has renounced the foundations of the law, right? Choice number one, follow your intellect and done, religion's out the window, right? That's option number one. I accept philosophy, I reject religion. And obviously that's a non-starter for the Rambam, right? And for the Rambam's reader, who already is committed. On the other hand, he goes on, or should he hold fast to his understanding of these terms, not let himself be drawn on together with his intellect, rather turning his back on it and moving away from it, while at the same time perceiving he'd brought loss to himself and harm to his religion. Right? Option 2, okay, if Torah says that God has a hand, he has a hand. What am I going to do? I have to just renounce reason. And notable, what does the Rambam say about that? If one does that, you have brought loss to himself and harm to his religion. Very important, right? That for the Rambam, if you don't follow your reason and just accept the literal truth of the Tanakh, completely untutored by any kind of philosophical reason. So you say Tanakh says God has a hand, God has a hand, done. He thinks that harms your religion, okay? So you have a clash. Do I follow reason or do I follow religion? And the Rambam says neither of those are going to work. Neither of those will be a satisfactory way to deal with this clash. And that's the beginning of medieval Jewish philosophy, right? Medieval Jewish philosophy is all about how do you negotiate this apparent conflict, the conflict between faith and reason, the conflict between the God of the Tanakh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the God of the philosophers. Because all of a sudden, it's called into question, right? If you don't have questions, you don't need answers. And we'd got on perfectly well for centuries, right? Even one might say millennia, just getting along with our Jewish worldview, the one we laid out before. And it hadn't been challenged. It had been challenged by pagans, but the attraction of paganism, let's say, wasn't their intellectual acuity, right? Paganism was sex and drugs and rock and roll. It wasn't because, wow, this is really intelligent and challenging to our worldview. This is the time at which Jews are exposed to a worldview that actually, to those who are understanding and reading this material, makes sense. They're like, wow, yeah, this is philosophically interesting, and yet doesn't seem to fit our worldview. So what do we do? And what makes for interest within the whole world of medieval Jewish philosophy is that the answers that different Jewish philosophers give to that question, the way they navigate their way through that conflict, is not the way you might expect, right? As my first ever teacher of Jewish philosophy put it, I was never going to do this for a living. I was going to be a scientist. And then when I went to Israel for a year at yeshiva, we had actually shiurim for the first time I ever really encountered Jewish philosophy, and it was in the Kuzuri. Somebody called Avram Stein, wonderful, wonderful guy. And he would teach us the Kuzuri. And I will never forget that at the end of one of the very, very first classes he gave, where he went through that Kuzuri text we just went through, right? The Philosopher's Creed. And he presents that. And he says, this is what the philosopher says. And this, Hallel absolutely rejects. And he left us with the following, which is what we've just read by the philosopher. Halevi utterly rejects. But according to the Rambam, these are divrei Elokim chayim, right? Now that might be a slight exaggeration, but the fact is that there are Jewish philosophers who do accept great swathes of that picture we just read, okay? And as I say, what makes for interest in medieval Jewish philosophy is how we navigate the conflict, and people do it very differently. And Yehuda Halevi on the one hand, the Rambam on the other, are probably the two poles here in terms of the extremes on either side. And then there are others who, you know, fall somewhere in between, or maybe it's not fair to say the Rambam's the extreme, maybe it's the Ralbag, but, you know, these are details. Fact is, this is at least medieval Jewish philosophy, right? You've suddenly got a project, a syllabus, okay? Does God have wants? Does God know what we're doing? Are we meant to be keeping mitzvot, or is it all about intellect? These were the questions. And therefore, regardless of the conceptual problem with which we began, there's something called medieval Jewish philosophy. And there was something they all had in common. There was something they were all doing. And what they're doing is navigating this conflict. And maybe one day we'll talk about some of the ways they do so. But for me, for tonight, that's my lot. So happy to take questions if people wish to and stay on, but obviously don't want to take anybody's time beyond.
Okay, before we take questions, sure, absolutely. Thank you very much. I want to thank you for really a very fascinating lecture. I apologize for the few minutes of in and out. I don't know why that happened, but anyways, I want to thank you. Everybody's welcome back. Next Sunday night, we'll have an intro to modern Jewish philosophy, the difference between modern and medieval Jewish philosophy. Tomorrow morning at 11 a.m., Tzvi Ramit will be giving a shiur from Israel on leadership in the Torah. Is there an ideal model? And then at 8:30, Dr. Mark Shapiro will be giving class, a continuous class on the Netziv, great rabbinic, figures we're going to have every day. I invite you to take a look. I want to thank you for coming. And we're, willing to hear all comments. This is obviously new for, I think, a lot of us. And, we'll hopefully to grow in it and to make it improved. And really, I want to thank you again, Dr. Rynhold. And if you want to ask questions, I appreciate your staying online to answer any questions they might have.
Yeah,
thank you very much.
So.
And Lila to everybody.
Yeah, and thank you. And those who are going now, thank you for being here, and everybody stay safe and well.
Amen. Amen.
So I see a question here from Miriam, which is he doesn't accept first or second solution. So what does he accept? Which is a very good question. So the fact is he accepts both, right? Because he thinks that ultimately the Torah and Judaism does teach us the rational truth. The interesting thing about him is he genuinely believes that Judaism is the most rational religion. He thinks that if one is, so to speak, if there's this one thing, this one value called truth, right? And all religions are trying to get to it. He believes Judaism has it, and then Islam has some of it, and Christianity has less of it. That's his hierarchy, right? Because for him, Islam is at least genuinely monotheistic in a way that Christianity isn't. Again, I say for him. And therefore he thinks that he doesn't have to give up on either of them, because ultimately they're saying the same thing. But to make them say the same thing, you end up with, like I mentioned or intimated earlier, a number of interpretations of all manner of concepts that are far from pshat, okay? Whereas Yehuda Halevi is much more going to shun those philosophical views that we explored or tried to explore when I was cutting out, apparently. But Yehuda Halevi is far more critical of the regnant philosophical worldview than is the Rambam, say. And I'm just using him as an example because he's a well-known one. So yeah, that's how. Any other questions or anything anybody wishes to address? My pleasure.
Okay.
I have a couple of raised hands there.
Ah.
Yehuda Greenfield and Azev we have.
Okay, should I go first?
Sure, Vakasha.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're saying that basically what medieval Jewish philosophy is trying to reconcile Jewish philosophy and the Torah.
Trying to reconcile philosophy in the Torah, or truth. Truth in the Torah might be better, because Yehuda Halevi would say the Torah is absolutely the truth, but it has truths that philosophy, as understood it in that picture we saw, simply cannot address, right? So they're all trying to reconcile or show the Torah is the truth. What they take that truth to be and how one reaches it is where you'll find the differences.
So I have a follow-up question, if I may.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way, I kind of see something similar today, which is people trying to reconcile science and the Torah.
Yes.
And I guess I'm confused. How is Rambam considered an important philosopher for like secular people? Like, I don't think Natan Slifkin or Nathan Aviezer or all these different people trying to reconcile science and Torah will ever be considered like great scientists. They'll be great apologetics or great way to reconcile the two, but they're not scientists. So like, how is Rambam considered a philosopher if his whole thing is about reconciling and trying to fit Torah into philosophy?
Right. Well, a number of reasons. One is that the manner in which he does so yields some very original philosophical views. I mean, interesting about the Rambam is he's one of the few people who is, I mean, say significant in Judaism is to underplay it, right? It's the Rambam, right? But he is one of the only Jewish philosophers who you will find sections written in a general work, none to do with Judaism, right? If you buy works on philosophy of religion, you will find segments of the Rambam, because he ended up coming out with certain views that were ultimately original to him as a result of this attempt he made to deal with the conflict we discussed. So for whatever reason, the Rambam actually did come out with some really interesting things that other philosophers took very seriously, both because they were original sometimes, also because he was I suppose he was the first really sophisticated attempt to reconcile this kind of Aristotelian metaphysics with religion, right? To say that a religious worldview can accept or absorb some of these philosophical ideas, and that's a very important stance within philosophy of religion. And like I say, he was, I'm trying to think, but I think it is fair to say the first really I guess sophisticated attempt to do that. I mean, Thomas Aquinas, right, who is the Rambam of the Catholics, Kiviyachol, right? So he quotes the Rambam. He quotes Rabbi Moises on a number of occasions, because he was seen as this really significant figure who had, paved the way for serious philosophers of religion. So I think those are two reasons why maybe he has the kind of towering reputation he does.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, do you, can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
I love that last question and the last answer. Are there any examples of where the Rambam was like the Renaissance man, in the sense, from a philosophical standpoint, where you can, like, as a follow-up to what you're saying, he was really original, and he stood out on a universal level?
So the most famous example of that is his quite well-known negative theology, right? So the idea that you can't say anything positive about God, while not unique to him, he is the most, funnily enough, the most extreme version of that view within that type of Aristotelian philosophical system. Right, there's another system of philosophy, Neoplatonism, that's very similar in terms of having this negative theology. But someone who develops that and develops it through argument, right? The Rambam takes that to a greater extreme than the majority of other philosophers of religion doing the same thing. So, for example, Aquinas is much less extreme than the Rambam on this kind of negative theology view. And that's the one where there's a very good philosophy of religion called Introduction to Philosophy of Religion by Brian Davies, And it's, you know, used by people in, you know, all universities all over the place to introduce philosophy of religion, and a whole section on the Rambam's negative theology. So that would be probably, I think that's the most prominent example where there's something that really you can pin on him and say he did something that stands out.
Do you have time for one more question?
I do, yeah. I obviously wouldn't want to keep anyone else here, but I'm happy to stay and talk.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, fine. Then I won't ask you. I'm not going to hold anyone up.
No. Go ahead.
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. So, when you were quoting the Rambam at the beginning of Moreh Nevuchim,
Yeah.
About that clash, and he seems to be implying for the real thinking man, if he goes with the very simple like Emunah Pshuta, you know, if you go down that path, you're really missing in your religion. Is he implying that for thousands of years Jews were missing something, or
no, not at all? Yeah. No, he's implying actually the opposite, which is even though they didn't write that way, they were great philosophers. As far as he's concerned, and again, this is a perfect example of something that when you present it to moderns, they think, oh, we can't really think that, it's disingenuous, but there's no question in my mind the Rambam absolutely believed it. Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest philosopher that's ever lived. That's what the Rambam would say. So it's not they missed anything, they knew it. It's just we've been reading them wrong, right? We've been reading Pshat when actually, and Pshat's fine, Pshat's important because it's important for the non-philosophers. But, you know, V'amevin Yavin, right? That actually the real truths buried beneath the, you know, Dibra Torah Lashon B'nai Adam, he's the one who utilizes it first in this particular way. Right, which is, look, the Torah has to write that way because it's not a work for esoteric philosophers, it's a work for Amcha, it's for everybody. But that means it needs to be capable of being understood at multiple levels. And the Rambam really does believe that Chazal as well, right? When Chazal say things that strike us as a bit bizarre and not rational, as the Rambam says explicitly in the Hakdamat Perek Chelek, in his Perish to the Mishnah, right? You know, he tells us that no, don't read it literally. To read it literally is to misunderstand.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. I just
We have time.
Great. Here we go. That's all right. I just need to plug in because I see that my battery is running out on my laptop. So just give me 1 second.
Mine?
And then go ahead.
Okay.
All right.
Easier than typing. So, why is the Rambam someone who tried to absorb or reconcile alien or foreign philosophy into Judaism accepted today by mainstream Judaism and traditional right-wing Judaism as a someone that we hold up, right? Other more modern people who tried to reconcile are rejected. And I know the Rambam's books were rejected in the beginning, but now they're accepted. He's accepted. So why him? Why do we accept him as an authority within mainstream or right traditional Judaism?
Sure. So the slightly facetious answer, but I think there's truth to it, is that he wrote the Mishnah Torah first. I always say that Spinoza would never have been put in Cherem if he'd have written a code of Jewish law first. So, you know, the fact is that we know that, well, let me maybe backtrack. You say the Rambam's accepted. The truth is he's not, because nobody actually reads Moreh Nevuchim, right? Nobody knows what he said about these issues. And if they did, they would probably stop accepting him, or they will do the other thing, the story that Menachem Kellner tells. So Professor Menachem Kellner is a wonderful scholar of the Rambam, and, you know, writes a lot of great stuff about him, but he tells this story, which is of his father. They moved from Europe to the States. And he said, and his father was a rabbi, And the one thing, the one assimilation to United States Jewry was they got a dog, right? Okay. And by the way, I'll tell you, it's true, right? In England, I knew very few Orthodox Jews with dogs. Got to America, loads of them. And we also assimilated. We got a dog. Anyway, and apparently, as Menachem tells the story of his father, once there's a mashulach at the door, somebody goes collecting, right? And knocks on the door of Rabbi Kellner. And he sees Rabbi Kellner come to the door, or at least someone who looks like Rabbi Kellner, with a dog. And the mashulach thinks to himself, so I know that Rabbi Kellner is a good Yid. And I know that they don't have dogs. So either this is not Rabbi Kellner or this is not a dog, right? He'd come a long way for his money, so he decided it wasn't a dog. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, people do that with the Rambam, right? So the Rambam holds views that are definitely philosophical views. This is not halachic, right? Halacha, absolutely committed to, got Mishnah Torah, that's unquestionable. But he holds views philosophically that are definitely not mainstream views in contemporary Orthodox Judaism, okay? Mm-hmm. And the problem is that, people are either unaware of that because, like I say, they don't read Moreh Nevuchim, or they read it and, like with Rabbi Kellner, say this is not a dog, as in they see a controversial view and they think, hang on, I don't think that as a Frum Jew. So clearly the Rambam couldn't think that. So despite the fact it's written there, he didn't say that, right? This is not a dog, right? So the truth is that, as I say, the Rambam qua philosopher is really not accepted. There are very few of the Rambam's philosophical views, with one very notable exception, which is God is not physical, right? That really began, and didn't begin, but nowadays, if I were to ask in any Orthodox shul, who thinks God has a body, I don't think I get a single hand up. And if I did, everybody would say, oh, it's kfira, right? Mm-hmm. That wasn't the case until, right? When the Rambam writes that you're a heretic, you're a min, if you say that God has guful gviyah, right, has any kind of body, right? The Ravid takes him to task famously. How can you say that, right? The Ravid didn't think that God was a body either, right? Mm-hmm. But he said, how can you say somebody does think that is a kofet? How can you say that when it's based on psukim? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that did filter down. The idea there is one God who is not in any way bodily was the one really key view that became absolutely mainstream, and so mainstream that to deny it now is deemed as completely beyond the pale. Mm-hmm. But that's about it. There are other views he takes that are, like I say, not mainstream within Orthodoxy, that if a rabbi preached them from an Orthodox pulpit would probably get in a lot of trouble, frankly, right? But that, the Rambam did take those views and reconciled them perfectly happily in his own mind as being absolutely consistent, if not the teachings of rabbinic Judaism, halachic Judaism. But that's why he's such an interesting and controversial figure when you actually, do read him and understand both sides, right? Both the halachic and the philosophical, which in his mind were, perfect bedfellows.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Okay, Dr. Rynhold, I think we'll let you go. Otherwise, you might be here all night. So I appreciate. Please God, we'll see you all back on Sunday. I do apologize for the few minutes, but please God, that will not be a problem going forward. And I want to wish everybody Laila Tov. Hope to see you during the week. The many shiurim we have, and thank you very much. And be well, stay healthy. We should all hear good news.
Okay, absolutely. And Rabbi Kalman, if I send you the file of the text,
absolutely. Even for next week, if you want to send me the files for next week, I'll post them. I can send them out in advance so people can have them.
I will do both.
Absolutely, and I'll post this week's site on the website. Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay,
Laila Tov. Be well and have a good week.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.